On March 27, 2021, two governments under U.S. sanctions signed a deal in Tehran, not a trade agreement, not a memorandum, a 25-year strategic partnership, up to $400 billion in Chinese investment. In exchange for something Iran has in abundance, oil, discounted oil, paid in yuan. The deal was signed before a single new kilometer of railway was laid, before a single port facility broke ground. The obligation came first. The infrastructure followed. By 2026, U.S. and Israeli strikes were hitting Iranian ports, bridges, and rail lines. The trains stopped. The oil contract didn't. This is the story of why China built a corridor it was prepared to lose, and what that tells you about who actually won this deal. March 27, 2021. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi signed China's comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran in Tehran. 25 years of economic, security, military, and technological cooperation. The investment figure, $300 to $400 billion, flowing from China into Iran's oil, gas, and petrochemical industries. In return, Iran supplies China with crude oil at a discount, and crucially, denominated in yuan, not dollars. That last part is the mechanism most coverage skips. U.S. sanctions against Iran are built around dollar transactions. Iranian oil cannot move through dollar-denominated financial systems without triggering enforcement. Yuan transactions operate entirely outside that architecture. China runs much of this trade through smaller independent refineries, often called teapot refineries, that process sanctioned Iranian crude without exposure to Western financial systems. The scale: by 2025, China was importing approximately 1.4 million barrels of Iranian oil per day. That's 13% of China's total crude imports. China accounted for roughly 80% of Iran's entire oil export volume. By one estimate, Iran was generating between $35 and $45 billion per year from Chinese oil purchases alone. This under the most severe American sanctions regime in decades. So let's answer the obvious question. What did China actually gain from this deal? First, cheap energy. Reuters reported in January 2024 that Iranian crude was trading at discounts of approximately $5 per barrel below market. At 1.4 million barrels per day, that's roughly $7 million in daily savings for Chinese buyers. Over a year, $2.5 billion. Second, leverage. Iran, cut off from Western capital with no other major buyer for its oil, had almost no negotiating power. Beijing structured a relationship of complete dependency. The Middle East Institute described it plainly. China saw Tehran's economic desperation as an opportunity to capitalize on Iran's limited bargaining power. Third, a corridor. Iran sits at the geographic center of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the southern overland route connecting China to Europe, Central Asia, and the Indian Ocean. Control that corridor, and China has a supply chain that bypasses U.S.-controlled sea lanes through the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca. The railway wasn't built for Iran. It was built for China's strategic independence. The first time a freight train ran from China to Iran, it was February 2016. A train left Zhejiang province in eastern China, crossed Kazakhstan, crossed Turkmenistan, and arrived in Tehran 14 days later. It had covered 6,462 miles. It carried 32 containers. It was historic. It was symbolic. And then it largely stopped. For years, the route was sporadic, disrupted by sanctions enforcement, customs incompatibilities between countries with different rail gauges, and the operational difficulty of running through three separate national systems. The 2021 deal changed the political architecture. But the serious infrastructure push came in phases. July 2024. The China-Iran freight service was formally relaunched at Aprin Dry Port, an inland container terminal southwest of Tehran, linked by rail and road to seaports and the National Rail Network. This launch was simultaneous with the opening ceremony for Phase 1 of the China-Europe Rail Corridor through Iran, attended by the heads of Iranian railways and ambassadors from China, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Early 2025, container traffic on the China-Iran railway route grew by 2.6 times compared to the same period the previous year. May 13, 2025, senior railway officials from Iran, China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Turkey met in Tehran to formally coordinate a transcontinental rail network. 13 days later, the first freight train from Xi'an, China, arrived at Aprin dry port on a direct, coordinated schedule. Through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, into Iran. 10,400 kilometers, approximately 14 days transit time, compared to 30 to 40 days by sea. By February 2026, Iran's railway chief announced that 60 trains from China, bound for Iran and the European Union, had entered the country. China was also building for the future. A contract was signed to electrify approximately 1,000 kilometers of Iran's east-west rail corridor, increasing freight capacity from 5 million tons per year to 15 million. A tripling. And on the Turkmenistan-Iran border at Saraksa, China was constructing a new railway terminal to accelerate container throughput on the corridor. By August 2025, Iranian officials confirmed the project was more than half completed. This was not a symbolic trade relationship. This was permanent infrastructure, built with the intention of operating for decades, which is why what happened next carries strategic weight that goes well beyond broken trains. Let's follow the money precisely. Iran is providing China with crude oil at approximately $5 per barrel below market price. At 1.4 million barrels per day, China's buyers are saving approximately $7 million per day. That number compounds over the 25-year term of the deal. But the deeper financial structure isn't the discount. It's the currency. By denominating oil sales in yuan and routing transactions through Chinese financial systems and smaller independent refineries, this entire trade relationship operates largely beyond the reach of US dollar-based sanctions enforcement. Iran isn't accessing the SWIFT system. It isn't using dollar clearing banks. It's billing in renminbi, accepting payment in kind, and routing goods through channels that Western regulators cannot easily monitor. The result? Iran generates tens of billions per year in revenue that doesn't technically violate sanctions in the way that would trigger enforcement by US-allied financial institutions. The deal also carried provisions beyond oil: military and security cooperation, technology transfers. According to reporting cited by the Middle East Institute, Chinese telecom company ZTE sold surveillance systems capable of monitoring landline, mobile, and internet communications to Iran's state telecommunications agency. China delivered infrastructure. Beijing got a client state. There's a phrase used in development economics for this kind of arrangement: debt trap diplomacy. Build infrastructure for a country that can't otherwise access international capital. Lock in long-term resource extraction. Create structural dependency. The $400 billion framework gave China 25 years of discounted energy and an infrastructure corridor through the most strategically positioned country in Western Asia. Iran got the trains, until the trains stopped. By early 2026, the China-Iran corridor was operating at a scale that had taken a decade to build toward. Then the strikes began. In March 2026, US and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military and infrastructure targets. The scope expanded rapidly. Chabahar, Iran's deep water port on the Arabian Sea, the entry point China and Russia needed for the international north-south transport corridor, was struck. Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest commercial port on the Strait of Hormuz, handling the vast majority of Iran's maritime trade, was also targeted. On April 7, 2026, the Israeli military confirmed it had struck 8 bridge segments across Iran, in Tehran, Karaj, Tabriz, Kashan, and calm. Iranian officials simultaneously reported damage to railway infrastructure. The same railway that 2 months earlier had been processing 60 trains from China. The strategic analysis from Jamestown Foundation, published March 31, 2026, was unambiguous. Attacks on key Iranian ports and infrastructure have stalled connectivity projects. Regional states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, which had been building supply chains around Iranian transit, are now reconsidering. The Middle Corridor, an alternative route through the South Caucasus and Turkey that bypasses Iran entirely, has moved from backup plan to primary option. The World Trade Organization, in statistics released March 19, 2026, warned that global merchandise trade growth is expected to fall to 1.9% in 2026, down from 4.6% in 2025. The Middle East conflict was cited as a primary driver. The corridor that China, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan spent years building, that 5 nations coordinated around, was functionally disrupted in a matter of weeks. The trains stopped. Here's what most coverage of this story gets wrong. China doesn't need the trains to win. The 25-year oil contract signed in March 2021 is not contingent on the railway operating. The discounted crude, 1.4 million barrels per day, continues moving. Through maritime routes, through sanctions workarounds, through yuan-denominated trade structures that U.S. enforcement cannot easily intercept. The railway was China's visible proof of investment. The infrastructure that gave Iranian leadership something to show its population. Look what aligning with Beijing produced for us. But Beijing's actual return on investment is not measured in containers per week. It's measured in barrels per day. And China has already been building the redundancy. The China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway is scheduled to become operational by 2030, a faster route from China to Europe that connects through Uzbekistan, already linked to Turkmenistan and Iran. It doesn't require Iran to be stable to function. It just needs Iran to be one optional node in a larger network. That's the architecture of what China built. Not a single railway, a network. Iran was never the destination. Iran was the hub of a southern corridor that China is now prepared to route around if necessary. The trains stopped. The network didn't. What is actually at stake and what nobody in mainstream coverage is seriously asking is what Iran got out of this deal. A 25-year oil commitment at a discount. Infrastructure that is now partially destroyed or unusable. Dependency on a partner that doesn't need the relationship to survive. That is the question core magnitude will keep tracking. Because the money doesn't lie. And the contract is still running. If you want to understand how power moves in the 21st century, follow the contracts, not the headlines. Subscribe to Core Magnitude.